Walk through Harlem streets on any given afternoon in 1966, and you will witness something remarkable. Bumpy Jonson emerging from a gleaming Cadillac, dressed in tailored suits that cost more than what most families in the neighborhood earn over half a year. The crowds instinctively create a path for him because everyone recognizes who he is and understands the empire he commands. This is the version of Bumpy Jonson that Harlem witnesses daily, a man whose wealth exceeds imagination. So powerful that city politicians actively seek his support and fellow criminals fear earning his disapproval. Sophisticated enough to engage in conversations about classical literature and current affairs with university intellectuals. Commanding enough that a single instruction from him can eliminate obstacles or permanently ruin someone's livelihood. The man whose criminal operations generate an estimated $50 million in assets, who provides employment to thousands either directly or indirectly through his numbers rackets, who resides in a luxury residence that would make wealthy white businessmen envious, who adorns himself with diamond jewelry and silk neckties, and handcrafted Italian footwear costing what his mother once earned across an entire year. But the prosperous, influential, seemingly invincible crime lord that Harlem observes today bears virtually no similarity to the Ellsworth Jonson, who stepped off the train in Harlem during March of 1919, as a 14-year-old child so impoverished that he possessed one pair of trousers with holes worn through the knees, one shirt that had been mended so repeatedly the original fabric was barely recognizable, and worn-out shoes with soles so deteriorated that he inserted pieces of cardboard inside to cover the gaps. That desperate, furious boy contained within him the seeds of what he would eventually construct. But nobody witnessing 14-year-old Ellsworth Jonson arriving in Harlem with his struggling family, carrying their entire possessions in two damaged suitcases, could have possibly predicted that this malnourished child from the Deep South would transform into the most powerful black gangster in American history. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? This is the hidden story, the narrative Bumpy Jonson refuses to discuss publicly, the account his closest confidants whisper about but rarely share openly because the truth remains too raw, too agonizing, too visceral. This is the chronicle of deprivation so extreme it influenced every decision Jonson made across the following 47 years of his existence. The story of starvation that never completely abandoned him, even after accumulating more wealth than he could possibly spend in 3 lifetimes. The story of degradation and helplessness that became the bedrock for constructing power that nobody could strip away from him. For the first time, investigators have interviewed individuals who knew Ellsworth Jonson before his transformation into Bumpy Jonson, childhood acquaintances from South Carolina, family members who remember the crushing poverty, educators who recognized his exceptional intellect and mourned when circumstances destroyed his academic potential, and their testimonies expose a childhood so devastating that Jonson's survival itself seems miraculous, let alone his transformation of that suffering into the driving force that constructed a $50 million empire. The first time I laid eyes on Ellsworth Jonson, he was approximately 6 years old and so emaciated you could literally count every rib through his clothing, recalls Samuel Matthews, now 67, who resided 3 houses away from the Jonson family in Charleston's colored district. Every child in the Jonson household appeared undernourished because that family never possessed sufficient food, but Ellsworth suffered the worst malnutrition because he would surrender his portions to his younger siblings. I remember my mother commenting that boy is going to perish from starvation before reaching 10 years of age, and truthfully, everyone in our neighborhood believed that would happen. We had all witnessed children die from severe malnutrition because it was not uncommon in our community, and Ellsworth appeared to be the next child who would not survive to adulthood. The Jonson family inhabited what generous people described as a shack, and what honest observers called a collapsing death trap waiting to fall apart. A wooden construction measuring roughly 16 feet by 20 feet that housed 9 human beings, William and Margaret Jonson, and their 7 children born between 1898 and 1912. Ellsworth, born October 31st, 1905, was the fourth child, which meant he experienced childhood in the middle of constant chaos. Never the oldest who received additional attention, never the youngest who received extra protection. Simply one of 7 children competing for food that was perpetually insufficient and parental attention that exhausted parents were too drained to provide. That dwelling they occupied was not suitable for livestock, Matthews continues, his voice still carrying anguish 6 decades later. The walls contained gaps so wide you could peer straight through them to the outside environment. Rainwater poured through the deteriorating roof whenever storms arrived. There existed no heating system except a tiny stove that could not warm anything beyond a few feet surrounding it. 9 individuals living in a space that could not have exceeded 320 square feet total, sleeping directly on the floor because they possessed no beds or mattresses, wearing identical clothing day after day because they did not own enough garments for people to change their attire. I recall thinking even as a young child that this situation was fundamentally wrong, that human beings should not be forced to exist in such conditions. But that was simply how colored families survived when they were desperately poor in South Carolina during that era, and the Jonson family was absolutely destitute. The poverty was not accidental or temporary in nature. It was structural, embedded into every aspect of how the economic system functioned for colored people during the early 20th century in the American South. William Jonson, Ellsworth's father, labored as a dock worker in Charleston, performing the type of physically destructive work that systematically ruined men's bodies across time. But that represented the only employment opportunities available to colored men who lacked formal education or specialized professional skills. The work was irregular and unpredictable, and the compensation was insultingly inadequate. 60 cents for an entire day of hauling cargo and loading ships and carrying loads so heavy they caused injuries that employers refused to treat or provide compensation for. William Jonson was among the hardest-working individuals I ever encountered, states Robert Wilson, 71, who worked alongside William on the Charleston docks during the 1910s. He would arrive every morning at 4:30 without fail, standing with 40 or 50 other colored men, hoping the white foreman would select him for work that particular day. Sometimes he would be chosen, sometimes he would not, but he appeared there every single morning regardless of the outcome. And when he did secure work, he labored harder than anyone else because he was terrified of being replaced, terrified of losing even those 60 cents he could earn when work was actually available. But you understand what the real tragedy was. William could work 6 complete days hauling cargo that would destroy most men physically, and at the end of the week, he would have $3.60 to show for it. $3.60 to feed a family of 9 people. You cannot accomplish that. It is mathematically impossible. You cannot feed 9 human beings on $3.60 per week. So the Jonson family was perpetually hungry, constantly behind on rent payments, always one emergency away from complete catastrophe. Margaret Jonson, Ellsworth's mother, worked even harder than her husband, though the word work does not adequately capture what she actually did. Margaret labored, there exists no other appropriate word for it, as a domestic servant for wealthy white families in Charleston, cleaning their homes, preparing their meals, raising their children, performing the intimate work of maintaining white families' comfortable existences, while her own children remained home alone raising themselves, because she was too occupied raising white children to have time for her own offspring. Miss Margaret worked for my aunt's family when I was young, says Eleanor Harrison, 69, a white Charleston resident who agreed to speak on condition her aunt's family remain unidentified. I remember my aunt discussing her, talking about how skilled she was at cleaning, how wonderful she was with children, how reliable and hardworking she appeared. And I remember my aunt paid her $2.50 per week for 6 days of work totaling 12 hours per day. My aunt believes she was being generous because some families only paid $2 per week. I was perhaps 10 years old at the time, and even I understood there was something fundamentally wrong about paying someone $2.50 for 72 hours of labor. But that was simply what colored domestic workers earned, and nobody questioned it. Now I am almost 70 years old and I think about Miss Margaret sometimes. Think about how she was raising my aunt's children because my aunt was too busy with her social activities and shopping expeditions to raise her own children. And meanwhile Miss Margaret's children were home alone because she could not afford to stop working. The injustice of it makes me physically ill even now, decades later. Between William's dock work and Margaret's domestic service, the Jonson family's total household income averaged approximately $12 to $15 per month during Ellsworth's childhood years, roughly $3 to $3.50 per week for a family of 9 people. From that impossible amount, approximately $3 went toward rent for the collapsing shack that was falling apart around them. Approximately $8 to $10 went toward food when they could afford to purchase food at all. And whatever remained, usually $1 to $2, had to cover everything else. Clothing for 7 growing children, firewood for cooking and minimal heating, medicine when someone fell ill, the endless small expenses that poverty does not eliminate but makes impossible to afford. There was never enough of anything, says Sarah Johnson Williams, 64, Ellsworth's younger sister who still resides in Harlem today. Never enough food, never enough money, never enough of anything we needed. I remember being 8 years old and asking Mama why we could not eat breakfast like other children did, and she began crying right there in front of me. She said, "Baby, we eat what we can afford to eat, and we can afford 1 meal per day if we are fortunate. 1 meal per day for 7 growing children." I was hungry every single day of my childhood until we relocated to New York. Every single day without exception. Your stomach physically hurts when you experience that level of hunger. Did you know that? It literally causes pain. And you cannot concentrate on anything, cannot think about anything except how desperately hungry you are, cannot sleep sometimes because the hunger keeps you awake through the night. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The hunger Ellsworth experienced during childhood was not the temporary hunger of missing a single meal or waiting too long between dinner and bedtime. It was chronic, grinding, unrelenting hunger that shaped his physical development and his psychological development in ways that would impact him for his entire remaining life. Medical experts who reviewed this case explained that children who experience severe malnutrition during critical developmental years often suffer permanent effects. Stunted physical growth, cognitive impairments, weakened immune systems, psychological trauma that manifests as persistent anxiety around food security that continues even when food becomes abundant later in life. Childhood starvation literally rewires the developing brain, explains Dr. James Mitchell, a physician who specializes in nutrition and child development. Children who grow up chronically hungry develop what we call scarcity mentality. Their brains are literally shaped by the experience of not having enough resources, which affects how they think about resources and security and survival for their entire lives. Many people who experienced severe childhood hunger report that even decades later, even when they have become wealthy and have access to unlimited food, they cannot shake the anxiety about food running out, cannot stop thinking about where their next meal will come from, cannot fully enjoy eating because part of their brain is always calculating whether there will be enough. It represents a form of trauma that does not heal simply because circumstances improve later in life. Ellsworth Johnson's relationship with food as an adult, described by people who have shared meals with him, bears all the characteristic signs of someone who experienced severe childhood hunger. Bumpy always finishes absolutely everything on his plate, says William Bub Hewlett, who has worked as Jonson's bodyguard and close associate for over 20 years. Does not matter if he is full or satisfied. Does not matter if he is dining at an expensive restaurant where he could order additional food if he desired it. He finishes every single bite without exception, and he becomes visibly uncomfortable when other people leave food on their plates uneaten. I have witnessed him at business dinners where white businessmen order expensive steaks and then only consume half of them, and you can observe Bumpy getting tense and angry almost, like it is personally offensive to him that these wealthy people are wasting food so casually. One time he actually confronted a man who had left most of his dinner untouched on the plate. Said, "Are you going to finish that, or are you just ordering food to waste it deliberately?" The man was shocked by the question, but Bumpy was not joking around. He genuinely cannot tolerate seeing food wasted under any circumstances. The scarcity mentality extended far beyond just food to every aspect of how Jonson accumulated and managed his substantial wealth. Bumpy saves absolutely everything, says Theodore Teddy Green, Jonson's attorney and financial advisor. He is worth $50 million, but he still saves rubber bands, still reuses envelopes, still keeps meticulous track of every single penny he spends. I have tried to explain to him that he does not need to be that careful anymore, that he has more money than he could possibly spend in 3 lifetimes, but he cannot help it. Growing up with absolutely nothing teaches you habits that do not disappear just because you become rich later in life. He has been wealthy for 30 years now, but part of him is still that hungry child in South Carolina making absolutely sure nothing gets wasted, because waste meant his family might not eat tomorrow. What makes Ellsworth Jonson's childhood poverty even more tragic is that it systematically destroyed educational opportunities that might have allowed him to escape poverty through legitimate means rather than through criminal enterprise. Multiple sources who knew young Ellsworth describe a child who was extraordinarily intelligent beyond his years, who learned faster than other children, who demonstrated analytical capabilities that should have been nurtured through advanced education, but that were instead wasted because schools for colored children in South Carolina barely functioned at all. Ellsworth Jonson was the smartest child I ever taught across 30 years of teaching, says Dorothy Hampton, 78, who was the teacher at the colored school Ellsworth attended irregularly between ages 7 and 11. He learned to read in mere weeks when most children required months of instruction. He could perform arithmetic calculations in his head that children twice his age could not do on paper. He asked questions that showed he was thinking about what he learned in ways that went beyond simple memorization. He wanted to understand how things worked fundamentally, why things were the way they were, how different pieces of knowledge connected to each other. I told his mother that Ellsworth could become something extraordinary if he had access to proper education, if he could attend a real school with qualified teachers and adequate materials and opportunities for advancement. But the school Ellsworth attended, the only school available to colored children in his Charleston neighborhood, was the opposite of what a child with his intelligence desperately needed. A single room serving approximately 60 children ranging from age 5 to age 14, taught by one teacher who had herself only completed 8th grade education. With no books except a few tattered textbooks that were decades old and had been discarded by white schools when they received new materials, with no paper or pencils except what children brought from home, with no heating in winter except what a small wood stove provided when the school could afford to purchase firewood. That school was an absolute insult, Hampton continues, her voice still carrying anger 60 years later. The white schools in Charleston had multiple classrooms, had qualified teachers with college educations, had new textbooks and supplies and laboratories and libraries. The colored school had me, one woman with an 8th grade education trying to teach 60 children of vastly different ages all in one room, and we had maybe 10 books total that were so old and so damaged they were barely readable. How is a brilliant child supposed to develop properly in those conditions? How is anyone supposed to learn when the very structure of the educational system is deliberately designed to ensure colored children receive the absolute minimum possible education, so they can barely read and write, but cannot develop the skills needed for professional careers? The inadequacy of the education available to Ellsworth was compounded by the reality that even if he had received excellent education, there were virtually no opportunities for educated colored people in South Carolina during the 1910s. Colored lawyers could not practice in most courts. Colored doctors could not treat white patients and struggled to earn livings serving only colored communities that were too poor to pay adequate medical fees. Colored teachers earned a small fraction of what white teachers earned and worked in schools that had essentially no resources. The few colored people who did manage to obtain advanced education often fled the South entirely because there were no opportunities to actually use their education in places where white supremacy was so total and complete. I told Ellsworth's mother that his intelligence would be wasted, Hampton says quietly. I told her that even if he remained in school, even if he somehow gained access to better education, the world was not going to provide him opportunities that matched his capabilities because the world did not care how intelligent colored children were. I have thought about that conversation so many times over the years. I crushed that mother's hope because I thought I was being realistic, thought I was preparing her for the truth that her brilliant son was not going to have the life his intelligence should have provided him. And I was correct in one sense. Ellsworth did not become a doctor or lawyer or professor. But I was also wrong because I never imagined he would become what he became. I never imagined that the intelligence I saw in that 11-year-old would be applied to building a criminal empire, instead of being applied to legitimate professions. Part of me wonders what Ellsworth Jonson could have accomplished if he had been born white or born 20 years later or born in a place where brilliant black children were given opportunities, instead of being told their brilliance did not matter. Ellsworth stopped attending school permanently when he was 11 years old, just stopped going one day and never returned despite his mother's pleading, despite his teacher coming to their shack to try to convince him to continue his education. I asked Ellsworth why he would not come back to school, Hampton recalls. He looked at me with eyes that were far too old for an 11-year-old child, and he said, "Miss Hampton, what is the point? You told my mama I am smart, but that it does not matter because no white person is going to give me a job that requires intelligence. So why should I waste time learning things that will not help my family eat? I can work and earn money instead of sitting in school learning how to read books we do not have about things that do not matter to our survival." I did not have an answer for him. He was absolutely correct. That was the tragedy. This brilliant child was making a rational decision based on accurate assessment of his circumstances, and his rational decision was to abandon education because education was useless for colored children in South Carolina. What shaped Ellsworth Jonson more than the hunger or the poverty or the destroyed educational opportunities was the rage, the burning, constant, all-consuming anger at the injustice of everything he experienced and witnessed. At the enormous gap between how hard his parents worked and how poor they remained regardless of their efforts. At the casual cruelty of white people who profited enormously from black labor while treating black people as subhuman. At the waste of his own intelligence because society had absolutely no use for intelligent colored children. At the entire system that seemed deliberately designed to ensure colored people remained powerless and poor regardless of their efforts or their capabilities. Ellsworth was angry all the time when we were children, recalls Samuel Matthews, the childhood friend who thought Ellsworth would die before age 10. Not loud angry, not fighting angry. He was not getting into fights with other children or causing trouble in the neighborhood, but you could see it in his eyes, in how he carried himself, in how he talked about white people and about the world. He was furious at the injustice of everything he witnessed. His father worked harder than any man I ever saw and could not feed his family adequately. His mother was exhausted all the time from working 2 jobs, and still they were desperately poor. Ellsworth was smarter than any child in our entire neighborhood but could not attend a real school. And he understood even as a child. He understood that this was not random bad luck or his family's fault. This was systematic, deliberate, designed to keep colored people down no matter what they did or how hard they tried. The rage crystallized around specific incidents that Ellsworth witnessed, and that stayed with him for decades afterward. I remember when Ellsworth was maybe 9 years old, says Sarah Jonson Williams, his younger sister. Our mother came home from work crying so hard she could barely speak coherently. The white woman she worked for had accused her of stealing, said Mama had taken food that the woman had actually told Mama to throw away, but had then forgotten giving that instruction. The woman threatened to call the police and have Mama arrested unless Mama apologized and accepted lower wages as punishment for the theft she did not commit. Mama apologized for something she absolutely did not do and accepted being paid even less than the almost nothing she was already earning, because if she lost that job we would starve to death. Ellsworth watched our mother cry from the humiliation of it, and I saw something change in his face. He did not cry or show emotion. He just got very quiet and very cold. And he said, when I grow up, nobody is ever going to be able to do that to me. Nobody is ever going to have power over me like that white woman has power over Mama. He was 9 years old, and he was already deciding that accumulating power was the only way to avoid the kind of powerlessness our mother experienced daily. Another formative incident occurred when Ellsworth was approximately 12 years old and witnessed his father return home from the docks with his hand crushed after a loading accident. The white supervisors had ordered colored workers to lift cargo that was far too heavy to lift safely, and when William's hand was crushed in the accident, the supervisor blamed William for being careless, refused to pay for medical treatment, told William he could either return to work with his crushed hand or lose his job entirely. My father wrapped his hand in rags and returned to work the very next day, Sarah remembers. His hand was probably broken, but he never got it treated because we could not afford a doctor, and his employer would not pay for treatment. That hand healed incorrectly and caused him pain for the rest of his life, reduced his ability to do physical labor, probably shortened his working life by years. And Ellsworth watched all of that happen. Watched his father injured because white supervisors cared more about moving cargo quickly than about colored workers' safety. Watched his father have to return to work injured because we desperately needed the money. Watched his father's hand heal wrong because we could not afford proper medical care. I think that was when Ellsworth decided that poverty was completely intolerable, that being powerless was intolerable, that he would rather die than live the kind of life our parents were living. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When the Jonson family decided to leave South Carolina and join the Great Migration to New York in 1919, they were making a decision that millions of black families made during that era, a desperate attempt to escape the brutal poverty and racism of the South in search of better opportunities in northern cities. But for 14-year-old Ellsworth, the migration was not just about finding better opportunities. It was about escaping a place that had tried to destroy him and finding a place where the intelligence and the determination and the rage that had been building inside him for 14 years could finally be channeled toward building the power and wealth he had decided were the only protections against the kind of powerlessness and poverty that had defined his childhood. I remember when Mama told us we were moving to New York, Sarah recalls. All of us children were excited except Ellsworth. We were thinking about the train ride, about seeing a big city, about going somewhere new and different. But Ellsworth's reaction was different. He said, "We are leaving this place, and we are never coming back here. I am never going to be poor again. I am never going to be powerless again. Whatever it takes, I am going to build something in New York that means I never have to live like this again." He was 14 years old, and he was already making a vow that he would spend the next 47 years keeping. The journey from Charleston to New York took 3 days with the Jonson family riding in the colored section of the train, carrying everything they owned in 2 battered suitcases and 1 wooden crate. They arrived at Penn Station on March 18, 1919, with exactly $3 remaining from the money they had saved for the trip, with no connections except William's cousin who had moved to Harlem 2 years earlier, with no plan except to find work and hope that New York offered the opportunities they had heard about from other migrants. I asked Ellsworth years later what he remembered about arriving in New York, says Theodore Green, his attorney. He said he remembered stepping off that train and looking around at Penn Station, at the enormous size of it, at the crowds, at the obvious wealth and power represented by that building, and making a decision. He decided that he was going to have some of that wealth and power, that he was not going to be the poor colored boy from South Carolina anymore, that whatever it took, he would become someone who had money and influence, and the kind of power that meant nobody could humiliate him or his family the way they had been humiliated in the South. He was 14 years old. Most 14-year-olds are thinking about school and friends and maybe girls. Ellsworth was thinking about how to accumulate enough power that he would never be powerless again. What Ellsworth discovered in Harlem was both opportunity and more injustice simultaneously. Opportunity because New York offered paths to wealth that had not existed in South Carolina, the policy gambling operations that Harlem residents played religiously, the informal economy of hustles and schemes and criminal enterprises that existed alongside legitimate work, the possibility that intelligence and ruthlessness could be converted into money and influence if someone was smart enough and determined enough and willing to take risks. But also more injustice because Northern racism, while less overtly violent than Southern racism, still kept colored people in subordinate positions, still paid them less than white workers performing identical work, still restricted where they could live and what opportunities they could access. Ellsworth was brilliant at understanding systems, says Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of policy, who was one of Harlem's most successful numbers operators and who became Ellsworth's mentor when he was a teenager. When he started working for me in 1920, he was 15 years old, and I could see immediately that this was not a normal street kid looking for quick money. This was someone who understood how power worked, how money worked, how systems worked. He would ask me questions about how I organized my operations, how I protected myself from police, how I dealt with competitors. He was learning constantly, analyzing everything, figuring out not just how to do what I did, but how to do it better and more efficiently. And the motivation was not greed, at least not normal greed. The motivation was this absolute determination never to be poor again, never to be powerless again, never to experience the kind of hunger and humiliation he had experienced as a child. Over the next decade, from age 15 when he started working for St. Clair to age 25 when he had established his own independent policy operations, Ellsworth Jonson transformed himself from a poor immigrant from South Carolina into one of Harlem's most successful criminals. He learned the policy business from St. Clair, learned how to organize runners and collectors, learned how to calculate odds and manage money, learned how to deal with police and politicians who demanded bribes for protection. He built a reputation for intelligence and reliability, for being someone who kept his word and who solved problems efficiently and decisively. And he accumulated money systematically. First hundreds of dollars, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Money that represented not just wealth but security, power, the ability to never be hungry again, the ability to protect himself and his family from the kind of poverty that had nearly destroyed them. The first time Ellsworth gave money to our mother, Sarah remembers, he was maybe 18 years old and he handed her $100. $100, more money than our mother had ever held at one time in her entire life. Mama started crying and tried to refuse it, said she did not want money from criminal activities, did not want her son risking himself doing illegal things. And Ellsworth said something I will never forget. He said, "Mama, you worked yourself nearly to death for 20 years for white people who paid you almost nothing and treated you like you were worthless. Now I am making more in a week than you made in a year, and I am giving it to you because you deserve to have some comfort after everything you sacrificed. Take the money, buy food, buy warm clothes, maybe stop working so hard because your son can support you now." Mama took the money, and from that day forward until she died in 1954, Ellsworth made sure our mother never had to work again. Made sure she lived in a nice apartment, made sure she had everything she needed. The money was illegal, but the love behind it was real. Today, in 1966, Bumpy Jonson controls an estimated $50 million in assets, cash and real estate and business interests, both legitimate and criminal, investments in various enterprises throughout New York. The exact figure is impossible to verify because Johnson's wealth is deliberately hidden through complex corporate structures and offshore accounts, but financial experts who have studied his operations estimate his net worth is somewhere between $45 million and $60 million, making him one of the wealthiest black men in America, and certainly the wealthiest black criminal in American history. Bumpy's wealth is structured very deliberately, explains Theodore Green. He owns apartment buildings throughout Harlem that generate rental income. He owns legitimate businesses like restaurants and nightclubs and taxi companies that provide legal income and employment for hundreds of people. He has investments in stocks and bonds managed through accounts that cannot be traced back to him directly. And then he has the policy gambling operations that generate millions per year in revenue. When you add it all together, his net worth is probably $50 million, maybe more. For context, that is equivalent to what some Fortune 500 company executives are worth. A poor boy from South Carolina who left school at age 11 is as wealthy as corporate presidents who went to Harvard. The wealth manifests in visible and invisible ways simultaneously. Visibly, Jonson lives in a luxury apartment on Sugar Hill, one of Harlem's most prestigious addresses. He wears custom suits from Italian tailors that cost $800 each. He drives a new Cadillac every year. He dines at the best restaurants, travels internationally, collects art and rare books. But the invisible manifestations of wealth might be more significant. The security of knowing he could stop working today and live comfortably for the rest of his life. The power to help family members and friends financially whenever they need assistance. The ability to influence politics through contributions and connections. The respect that comes from being wealthy in a society that measures human value in dollars. But here is what people do not understand about Bumpy's wealth, says William Hewlett. The money is not just about having nice things or living comfortably. The money is about power and security and never being vulnerable the way he was vulnerable as a child. Bumpy could live in a mansion in Westchester if he wanted to. He can afford it easily. But he chooses to live in Harlem, chooses to be visible in his community, chooses to use his wealth in ways that help other people who are struggling the way his family struggled. He remembers what it is like to be hungry. He remembers what it is like to watch your parents work themselves to exhaustion for almost nothing. And that memory drives everything he does with his money. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Jonson's charitable activities, largely unreported by mainstream press but well known throughout Harlem, include annual Thanksgiving turkey distributions that feed thousands of families, regular financial support to churches and community organizations, informal assistance to individuals who need help with medical bills or rent or other emergencies. Bumpy gives away probably $200,000 to $300,000 per year to help Harlem residents, estimates Green. Sometimes it is organized charity like the Thanksgiving turkeys. Sometimes it is individual assistance. Someone comes to him saying they are about to be evicted, and he pays their back rent immediately. Sometimes it is supporting community institutions like funding youth programs or helping churches repair their buildings. He does not publicize it because he is not doing it for recognition. He is doing it because he remembers being the person who needed help, remembers what it is like when there is no safety net and no help available. Despite 47 years of distance from the poverty of his childhood, despite wealth beyond anything he could have imagined as a starving child in South Carolina, despite power and influence and success that should have erased the trauma of those early years, Bumpy Jonson remains shaped by the hunger and the powerlessness and the rage that defined the first 14 years of his life. You can see it in how Bumpy operates, says Stephanie St. Clair. He has been wealthy for decades, but he is never wasteful, never careless with money, never takes security for granted. He still thinks like someone who is one crisis away from poverty, even though he is one of the richest men in Harlem. That comes from growing up with nothing. Once you have experienced real hunger, once you have watched your parents work themselves to exhaustion and still not have enough, once you have felt that kind of powerlessness, it does not leave you. It stays with you forever, shapes every decision you make, drives you to keep accumulating power and wealth even when you have more than enough, because somewhere deep inside you are still that hungry child terrified of going back to having nothing. The trauma manifests in unexpected ways. Bumpy cannot stand seeing children go hungry, says Sarah Johnson Williams. If he sees a child who looks underfed or who he learns is not eating properly, he has to do something about it immediately. I have seen him give mothers money to buy food for their children. I have seen him arrange for families to receive regular deliveries of groceries. One time he learned that a school in Harlem had children coming to class without breakfast, and within a week he had arranged for a church to provide free breakfast to those children every morning. It is not just charity. It is personal. Those hungry children are him 60 years ago, and he cannot bear seeing them suffer the way he suffered. Friends and associates report that Jonson sometimes has nightmares about his childhood, dreams where he is back in South Carolina hungry and powerless, dreams where his wealth disappears and he is poor again. He told me once that he still sometimes wakes up frightened, says Theodore Green, frightened that everything he has built will disappear somehow, that he will end up back where he started. Intellectually, he knows that is not going to happen. He has diversified his assets, protected himself financially, built security that cannot be easily destroyed. But emotionally, the fear of losing everything and being poor again never completely leaves him. That is the legacy of childhood poverty. It scars you in ways that do not heal just because circumstances improve. The question that haunts everyone who knows Bumpy Jonson's full story is what he could have become if he had been born in different circumstances. If his intelligence and determination had been channeled toward legitimate pursuits instead of toward crime. If society had provided opportunities for brilliant black children, instead of deliberately destroying those opportunities through segregation and discrimination. I think about this all the time, says Dorothy Hampton, the teacher who recognized Ellsworth's brilliance when he was a child. What could that brilliant mind have accomplished if he had had proper education? If he had been able to go to college, to graduate school, to pursue whatever field interested him? He could have been a doctor, a lawyer, a professor, a scientist. He had the intelligence to become anything he wanted to become. But society did not give him those opportunities.